Join me as I dive into some of the scariest animated horror stories and see if I can handle them without getting too freaked out. There's something about animated horror stories that just gets under your skin, you know? They have this way of tapping into our deepest fears and keeping us up all night, wondering what's lurking in the shadows. And today, I'm going to share some of the most terrifying ones with you. So buckle up and let's get started. One of the universal fears that I think every single one of us can relate to is the fear of the dark. I mean, who hasn't been scared of what might be lurking in their closet or under their bed as a kid? It's this primal fear that's been ingrained in us since childhood, and it's something that storytellers love to play with. Take, for example, the classic monster under the bed trope. It's a fear that's so ingrained in us that it's been used in countless horror movies and stories. But the fear of the dark can manifest in so many different ways. Sometimes it's the unknown, the unseen force that's lurking just out of sight. Other times, it's the darkness within ourselves, the parts of our own psyche that we try to keep hidden. And then there are times when it's just the simple fear of being alone in the dark, with no one to turn to for comfort. Whatever the manifestation, one thing's for sure, the fear of the dark is something that gets to all of us. The way that storytellers tap into this fear is by creating an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty. They use the darkness to create a sense of foreboding, to make you feel like something's just waiting to pounce. And when it does, it's like a punch to the gut. It takes your breath away and leaves you gasping for air. So, with that said, let's dive into some of the scariest animated horror stories out there and see how they use the fear of the dark to get under our skin. The first story is about a girl who moves into a new house with her family, only to discover that it's haunted by the ghost of a young boy who died there. At first, it's just little things, doors creaking open, lights flickering on and off. But as time goes on, the haunting becomes more and more intense, until the girl is convinced that the ghost is trying to communicate with her. The twist in this story is that the ghost isn't a malevolent spirit at all. It's just a lost soul who's trying to find his way. It's a story that's both heartbreaking and terrifying at the same time. The second story takes place in a small town where people start to disappear one by one. At first, it seems like a serial killer is on the loose, but as the bodies start to pile up, it becomes clear that something much more sinister is at play. The twist in this story is that the disappearances are all connected to an old urban legend about a creature that's said to roam the woods at night. It's a story that's both creepy and unsettling, and it'll leave you wondering what's real and what's just myth. The third story is about a group of friends who decide to explore an abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town. As they make their way deeper into the asylum, they start to uncover clues that suggest that the hospital was shut down due to some kind of sinister experiment. The twist in this story is that the friends aren't alone in the asylum. They're being stalked by the ghosts of the former patients, who are determined to make sure that the truth about the hospital never gets out. The fourth story is about a boy who's trapped in a time loop, reliving the same day over and over again. At first, it seems like a weird anomaly, but as the loop continues, the boy starts to uncover clues that suggest that something much more sinister is at play. The twist in this story is that the boy isn't alone in the loop. There's someone else who's trapped with him, someone who's determined to make sure that the boy never escapes. But of all the stories I've heard, there's one that still gives me chills to this day. It's about a girl who discovers that her mirror is haunted by the ghost of a woman who died in front of it. At first, it's just little things. The ghost appears in the mirror, whispering strange phrases and warnings. But as time goes on, the haunting becomes more and more intense, until the girl is convinced that the ghost is trying to take over her body. The twist in this story is that the ghost isn't a ghost at all. It's the girl's own reflection, come to life to torment her. It's a story that's both creepy and unsettling, and it'll leave you wondering what's real and what's just your imagination. The thing that gets me about this story is that it's so unexpected. I mean, you think you know where it's going, but then the twist hits you like a ton of bricks. It's one of those moments where you're left sitting there, mouth agape, wondering what you've just seen. And that's what makes it so scary. It's the unpredictability, the sense that anything can happen at any moment. But that's what makes animated horror stories so effective, don't you think? They have this way of tapping into our deepest fears, of making us feel like anything can happen. And that's what makes them so terrifying. They're not just stories, they're experiences. They're a way of confronting our fears head-on, of facing the unknown and coming out the other side. So, what did you guys think of these stories? Which one scared you the most? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you've got a scary story of your own, I'd love to hear it. Share it with me in the comments, and I might just feature it in a future video. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to check out my next video, where I'll be sharing even more spine-chilling tales. Part 1. The Animation's Dark Shadows. There's something about animated horror stories that gets under your skin, you know? It's a different kind of terror, like a dream brought to life. It hides in the smooth flow of the art, creeping into your mind in ways you can't anticipate, twisting reality just enough that you start to doubt everything around you. And that's exactly what happened to me. It began as simple curiosity, watching horror animations late at night. But now, I can't shake the feeling that it's followed me into my world, lingering just at the edge of my vision. I'd always been a horror junkie. Slasher films, psychological thrillers, I ate them up like popcorn. But animated horror, that's where the fear felt different. The first time I experienced it, I was 16, scrolling through some late-night YouTube binge. I stumbled upon a playlist of creepy animations, ghost stories, urban legends, things that felt childish in their art style but deeply unsettling in their narrative. The animation wasn't slick like the stuff on TV. It was jagged, raw. Somehow that made it worse. One night, I watched one about a haunted mirror. The story seemed innocent at first, just a girl alone in her room, gazing into her reflection. But the subtle animation, the way her reflection seemed to lag behind her movements, caught my attention. At first, you couldn't even tell what was wrong. The shifts in the mirror were so slight, you'd convince yourself it was just a glitch. But then, the girl began to notice it too. Her reflection would tilt its head when she didn't, blink when her eyes were open, and slowly, it got bolder. By the end of the story, the reflection was moving freely, a twisted version of her, leaning forward from inside the mirror as if it could crawl out. Just when the animation was about to reveal something truly horrifying, the screen cut to black with a final, soft whisper. "It's behind you." That night, I didn't sleep. But it wasn't the mirror girl that haunted me. It was the way it made me feel. There was something unnerving in how the animation unfolded. The pacing, the buildup of dread. The darkness felt alive in my room after that, like something waited just beyond the glow of the screen. And that's when things began to change. At first, it was subtle. My reflection in the bathroom mirror started to feel wrong. Not immediately, but over time. Every time I'd brush my teeth or glance in passing, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. You know when you look at something for too long, and it feels like it's moving? That's how it was. I'd see a flicker in the glass, just at the edge of my vision, but when I focused on it, nothing. Just me, staring back, exhausted. I told myself it was paranoia. I mean, after all, I'd been consuming hours of these creepy, dark animations. It was bound to mess with my head, right? Then one night, the dream started. I was back in the animated world, like one of the characters from the stories. But this wasn't like normal dreaming. It felt visceral, sharp. I could feel the cold floor beneath my feet as I walked down a long hallway. The walls were covered in mirrors, stretching all the way up to the ceiling. And no matter where I turned, I was never alone. My reflection, distorted and twitching, followed me in every glass surface. In the dream, I tried to run. I could hear the faint sound of glass cracking behind me, like something was trying to break free. I ran faster, but the mirrors were endless. When I finally stopped, panting and terrified, I faced one last mirror. My reflection smiled, slow, deliberate, and wicked, and stepped forward. I screamed, but no sound came out. That's when I woke up. Sweat covered my body, and I was sure I wasn't alone in the room. But when I turned on the light, everything was normal, except for one thing. The mirror on my wall, a large floor-length one, had moved. It had tilted ever so slightly, as if someone had pushed it from the other side. I tried to convince myself that it had always been like that. Maybe I'd bumped it earlier. But deep down, I knew better. Something had changed. Something had crossed over. Part 2. Something's watching. After that dream, I became hyper-aware of every mirror in the house. Every time I caught my reflection, it felt like an invasion, a mockery of my real self, standing there, grinning just a little too wide. But I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that I was just tired, maybe even a little crazy from all the horror content I'd been binging. That didn't stop the feeling, though. The unsettling sensation of being watched, even when I was alone, persisted. It was like something had found its way into my world through the screen. It was absurd, but I couldn't deny that creeping anxiety. My bathroom mirror, the hallway one, even the dark windows at night, they all felt like eyes staring back at me. Then came the night I saw it. It was late, maybe 1 a.m., and I was finishing another animated horror video. This one about an old woman who could only be seen in reflections. I was already spooked, so I decided to go to bed early. As I made my way down the hallway, I had to pass by the mirror that hung on the wall, an antique one we'd inherited from my grandmother. Its frame was cracked, old, and the glass had that slightly warped quality where reflections looked distorted if you weren't standing directly in front of it. As I passed by, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't stop myself from glancing at it, just a quick look, and that's when I saw it. In the dim glow of the hallway light, I could see my reflection standing perfectly still, even though I was still moving. But that wasn't the worst part. My reflection wasn't alone. Behind me, barely visible in the shadows, stood something else, something dark and twisted. It was human-shaped but wrong, hunched over with elongated limbs and a face that didn't look quite real, like it had been sketched quickly, then smeared. The eyes. Its eyes were too big, and they locked onto mine in the reflection, wide and staring, almost hungry. I froze. My whole body seized up as I stared at the figure behind me. It didn't move. It didn't need to. The longer I looked, the more it felt like it was pulling me in, like gravity itself had shifted toward the mirror. My breath caught in my throat, and I had the overwhelming urge to turn around and face it in the real world. But something, some primal instinct, stopped me. It wasn't in the hallway. It was only in the reflection. But somehow that was worse. My body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I was trapped in my own gaze, locked in with whatever that thing was. I could hear it in my head, whispering in a language I didn't understand. Its eyes bore into me like it was digging through my skull, trying to tear something out of me. Finally, I snapped. I don't know how I did it, but I broke eye contact, stumbling back and nearly crashing into the wall. My reflection moved with me then, mirroring my panic as I backed away from the mirror. The thing, though, stayed behind, still there, still watching. As soon as I was far enough from the glass, it melted into the shadows, disappearing as if it had never been there. I stood there for a long time, heart hammering in my chest, trying to convince myself it had been a trick of the light, maybe sleep deprivation messing with me. But deep down, I knew the truth. That thing had been real, and it had seen me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the weight of that stare, lingering in the dark corners of my mind. And every mirror in the house seemed to be watching, waiting. Over the next few days, things only got worse. It wasn't just the mirrors anymore. It was the screens too. My phone, my TV, anything with a reflective surface. I'd catch glimpses of things that shouldn't be there. Faint shapes, shadows moving when nothing was in the room, eyes staring back at me when I checked my messages. Every time I thought I'd imagined it, there'd be another flicker, just enough to keep me on edge. Then the dreams came back. They weren't the same as before. Now, I was trapped in an endless room of mirrors. There was no door, no escape. I'd see myself reflected 1,000 times over, but none of the reflections were really me. Some were smiling when I wasn't, others moved when I stood still. But worst of all, that shadowy figure was always there, lurking behind me in every reflection, just out of reach, always watching. I tried to avoid the mirrors after that. I covered them, turned them around, anything to stop myself from seeing that thing again. But it didn't help. I started seeing it in places where there shouldn't have been reflections. In puddles, in windows I passed on the street, even in the eyes of people I spoke to. I couldn't shake it. It was like I was being followed everywhere I went, but no one else seemed to notice. My friends thought I was losing it, that the horror videos were finally getting to me. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just paranoid, seeing things where there was nothing. But I knew better. There was something in the dark now, something I had let in, and it was getting closer. One night, I woke up with the sudden, sickening certainty that it was no longer content to stay behind the glass. I could feel it, hovering in the room with me, breathing in the same air. I didn't want to look, didn't want to confirm what I already knew. But I couldn't stop myself. I turned over slowly, my heart hammering, and saw it standing there at the foot of my bed. Its eyes wide, unblinking, staring straight into my soul. It wasn't just in the mirrors anymore. It was here, and I was no longer safe. Part 3. Shadows in the Glass. After that night, everything changed. It was as if the line between what was real and what lived in the reflections had blurred completely. I could no longer trust my own eyes. The figure that had once lurked behind the glass had crossed over into my world, and now it was always there, watching from the corners of every room, lurking in the shadows where the light couldn't quite reach. It didn't move, didn't attack, but its presence was suffocating. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, couldn't even look in a mirror without feeling like I was being dragged toward it. My apartment had become a prison, and the windows, the mirrors, even the shiny surface of my kitchen counter, they had become portals, each one a doorway into somewhere dark and twisted, where that thing lived and waited. I tried to talk to someone about it. My best friend Emma had always been the practical type, never one to scare easily. But when I told her what was happening, she just gave me this half smile and told me I was letting my imagination get the best of me. Maybe lay off the horror stuff for a while, she'd said, laughing it off. But she hadn't seen it. She didn't know what it was like to feel the constant weight of something unseen breathing down your neck. The worst part was, I couldn't escape it. Even at work, in the middle of the day, I'd catch glimpses of it. My reflection in the office windows would be there. But sometimes, just for a second, it wasn't alone. There'd be a flash of dark eyes in the reflection, staring over my shoulder, and when I'd turn around, nothing. The air would feel colder, though, like someone had been standing too close, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was all in my head. But the more I fought it, the stronger it seemed to become. One night, after yet another dream where the thing in the mirror had started speaking to me, though the words were muffled, incomprehensible, I woke up to find something new. The mirrors were different. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. Everything looked normal. My room was just as I had left it, the blinds half drawn, my phone lying face down on the nightstand. But when I glanced toward the mirror across from my bed, I noticed that the reflection wasn't quite right. It was too dark. I squinted, trying to make out the details of the room in the reflection, but it was like the light didn't touch it the same way. It felt almost deeper, like I was looking into another version of my bedroom, one where the shadows were thicker, more alive. I stood up, my heart racing, and moved closer to the mirror. That's when I saw it again. There, in the corner of the reflection, just beyond the edge of where the real world ended, was the thing. Its silhouette was clearer now, the long, twisted limbs and hunched posture more defined. It stood there, motionless, its wide eyes locked on me through the glass. But this time, something was different. It was smiling. My stomach lurched as I took a step back, the smile growing wider as if it knew I was afraid. And that's when I noticed, its smile wasn't just on its face. It was in the reflection of my face, too. My own reflection was smiling back at me, even though my lips were tightly shut. It was subtle at first, just a twitch at the corner of my mouth, but it spread slowly until my reflection was grinning, a grotesque, wide-mouthed smile that felt like it was mocking me. I stumbled back, tripping over the edge of my bed, my heart pounding in my ears. The reflection, my reflection, continued to smile even as I turned my back to the mirror, refusing to look any longer. I wanted to scream, to shatter the glass, but I was terrified that if I did, it would only get worse. What if breaking the mirror only freed it? I couldn't go back to sleep after that. I sat on the edge of my bed, the mirror covered with a towel, my eyes locked on the floor as I tried to calm myself down. But it was no use. Every time I blinked, I saw it again, The reflection, that dark figure standing in the shadows, waiting for me to make the mistake of looking too long. I needed help. Real help. The next morning, I did the one thing I thought I'd never do. I want to see a psychic. I didn't believe in that kind of thing. Not really. But I was desperate. My logical mind had crumbled under the weight of whatever had latched onto me. I needed answers, even if they came from a woman burning sage and reading tarot cards. Her name was Mira, and her shop was tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city. One of those places you'd walk by 100 times without ever noticing. When I stepped inside, the smell of incense hit me immediately. Thick, sweet, and a little overpowering. Mira herself was older, with long, graying hair tied in a loose braid. She had a kind face, but her eyes were sharp, as if she could see straight through you. I told her everything. About the animated horror stories, about the figure in the mirrors, the dreams, the strange happenings around my apartment. I expected her to look at me with skepticism, to chalk it up to stress or overactive imagination. But she didn't. Instead, she nodded, her face growing more serious with every word. "You've drawn something to you," she said quietly, her voice low. "Something that feeds on fear, on reflection. It's been waiting for an opening, and now it's found one." "What do you mean?" I asked, my throat dry. "What did I do?" "It's not about what you did," she said, standing and moving toward a small cabinet. She pulled out a bundle of dried herbs and a small bottle filled with some kind of oil. "It's about what you saw. These things, they exist in the spaces we don't look. Mirrors, shadows, places where reality doesn't quite fit. You've been watching them, and now they've started watching back. Can you get rid of it?" Mira hesitated, her eyes flicking to the mirror that hung on the wall behind me. For a moment, her expression darkened, like she could see something there that I couldn't. "I can try," she said finally, "but it's strong. If it's already crossed over, there's no guarantee it'll leave willingly." She started burning the herbs, muttering something under her breath as she walked around the room, waving the smoke in every corner. I sat there, feeling both foolish and terrified, but desperate enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, this would work. But then, as the smoke filled the room, something strange happened. The mirrors around the shop, there were a few, small ones hanging here and there, began to fog over, like someone was breathing on them from the other side. At first, I thought it was just the smoke, but then I saw it. The reflection. It was there again, in every mirror, in every piece of glass. That same twisted figure, hunched over and grinning, its eyes locked onto mine from every angle. It was everywhere, surrounding us, staring back at me through the fog. Mira stopped, her face going pale. "It's here," she whispered, barely audible. "It's already here." Part 4, Through the Looking Glass. Myra's words hit me like a punch to the chest. It was here. It had followed me, not just lurking in the mirrors at home, but spreading, pushing its way through any reflective surface it could find. I had brought it with me, and now it was showing itself in every single mirror around us. "Get up," Mira said sharply, her voice trembling as she moved to grab something from behind the counter. "You need to get out of here now." I stood, but my legs felt like jelly, barely able to hold my weight. I glanced around at the mirrors hanging on the walls, each one clouded with that fog, each one showing that grinning, twisted figure, waiting, watching. My heart raced as the room seemed to shrink, the air thick with the oppressive presence of whatever this thing was. Mira came back with a small pouch in her hands, shoving it into mine. "Take this," she said quickly, her eyes darting nervously toward the mirrors. "It's a protection charm. It might not be enough to stop it, but it will slow it down, keep it from getting too close." "What do you mean too close?" I asked, my voice shaking. "It's already everywhere." No," Mira interrupted, gripping my arm tightly. "It's in the reflections, yes, but it hasn't fully crossed over. Not yet. It's trying to get through, to you. That's why it's appearing more often, why it's showing itself so clearly. The more you look, the stronger its connection becomes." I felt sick, my stomach twisting in knots as I processed what she was saying. It was feeding off my fear, off the attention I was giving it. By watching it, by not looking away, I had been inviting it in, little by little. Mira glanced toward the door, then back at me. You need to go. Don't stay anywhere with mirrors or reflective surfaces, at least not for the next few days. Cover everything. Keep it out of sight, out of mind. And do not, under any circumstances, look directly at it again. I nodded, clutching the pouch tightly, but my hands were shaking. It felt like every shadow in the room had eyes now. Every bit of glass was a window to something dark and hungry. I didn't understand what this thing was, not fully, but I knew one thing. It wanted me. I thanked Mira, though the words felt hollow, and hurried out of the shop. Outside, the air was cool and fresh, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even in broad daylight, with people bustling around me, everything felt wrong. I kept my head down as I walked, avoiding the glances of windows, car mirrors, anything that might catch my reflection. When I got home, I followed Myra's advice and covered every mirror, every screen, with sheets, towels, anything I could find. My bathroom mirror, my hallway mirror, even the windows that gave off too much of a reflection. For the first time since it all started, I felt a small sense of relief, like I could breathe again without the weight of something watching me. But that night, it came back. I hadn't realized just how many reflective surfaces existed in a single room. The TV, even when turned off, gave a dull reflection of the living room. The small mirror on the back of my phone case caught glints of the ceiling. Even the polished surface of my coffee table shimmered faintly in the low light. It was everywhere. I woke up at around 3 a.m., the same time I'd had all those nightmares about the mirrors. The room was dark, but I could feel it, the sense that something was off. My skin prickled with unease, my heart pounding as I lay there in the silence, listening to the faint hum of the city outside my window. And then I heard it. A soft scratching sound. It was so faint, at first I thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I turned slowly toward the sound, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. It was coming from the covered mirror across the room. The sheet I had draped over it was shifting slightly, like something was brushing against it from the other side. My mouth went dry as I sat up in bed, staring at the mirror. I could feel it. It, behind the fabric, clawing at the barrier, trying to get through. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and I found myself frozen, unable to move. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Suddenly, the sheet fell, crumpling to the floor in slow motion, revealing the mirror in full. And there, standing just behind my reflection, was the figure. But this time, it wasn't a shadowy silhouette. It was clear now, almost real. Its face, twisted and wrong, grinned that same grotesque smile, its eyes black and bottomless. It raised a long, bony hand and placed it on the glass, as if testing the boundary, seeing how thin the veil between us had become. I couldn't look away. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, but I was locked in place. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't me anymore. The thing behind me smiled wider, its lips stretching too far, and suddenly, my reflection moved on its own. It stepped closer to the glass, tilting its head at an unnatural angle, as if it were studying me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to shut my eyes, but my body wouldn't obey. The figure raised its hand again, and this time, it pushed, gently, almost curiously, against the surface of the mirror, and the glass began to give. It didn't shatter. It didn't crack. It bent, like the surface of water, rippling outward as the figure pressed harder, trying to slip through. I could feel the cold radiating from the mirror, a chill that seeped into the room, into my bones. My reflection stood there, a puppet under its control, while the thing kept pushing. The moment its hand broke through the glass, I snapped. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy book from my nightstand, and hurled it at the mirror. The sound of shattering glass filled the room as the mirror exploded into 1,000 shards, glittering in the dim light. For a moment, the world was still, the pieces of the mirror scattering across the floor. But then, I felt it. It was no longer in the reflection. It was here. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as I looked around the room. There was no sign of the figure, No shadowy silhouette, no twisted reflection. But I could feel its presence, heavy and cold, like the air itself had turned against me. And then, slowly, from behind me, I heard a soft, wet breath, right against my ear. I bolted. Grabbing my phone and keys, I ran out of the apartment without looking back. The night air hit me like a slap in the face, but I didn't stop. I didn't stop running until I was blocks away, my heart pounding, my lungs burning. Only then did I collapse against a bench, my mind racing. The thing wasn't in the mirrors anymore. It was free. And now, I had no idea where it was. Part 5. Nowhere to hide. For hours, I sat on that bench, trying to figure out what to do next. My breath came in shallow gasps, the weight of panic pressing down on my chest. The streets were quiet, empty, like the city itself was holding its breath. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like the shadows were watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The thing was out now. I had broken the mirror, and with it, the fragile barrier that kept whatever it was confined to the glass. It was somewhere out here with me, and I had no way of knowing where it might appear next. Every shadow, every reflective surface felt like a doorway to that thing's twisted world. But worse, I had no idea how to fight it, or if I even could. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling, and called Emma. She picked up after only a couple of rings, her voice groggy. "Hey, it's the middle of the night. What's going on?" she asked, clearly still half asleep. I wanted to tell her everything, to scream that something was after me and I had nowhere left to run. But how could I explain it? How could I make her understand without sounding insane? I need to come over, I managed to say, my voice cracking. "Please, I can't be alone right now." There was a pause on the other end. "Jesus, are you okay? You sound awful." "I'm not," I whispered, looking around at the empty street, feeling like something was creeping up behind me. "I'm not okay. Please, Emma." "Yeah, of course. Get over here. I'll leave the door unlocked." Relief washed over me, but it was only temporary. I stood up from the bench and started walking, keeping my eyes down, avoiding every passing car, every window. I didn't know how much of the city it could reach through, or if it could find me here. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, had to stay ahead of it somehow. Emma's apartment wasn't far, but the walk felt like it stretched on forever. Every step echoed in the empty streets, the silence pressing in around me like a vice. I kept catching glimpses of movement from the corner of my eye, just quick flashes of something darting out of sight, slipping into the shadows. I knew it was there, stalking me, waiting for me to slip up and look in the wrong place. By the time I reached Emma's building, I was drenched in cold sweat. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor, and I hurried up the stairs 2 at a time, practically throwing myself against her door. It swung open easily, just like she promised, and I stepped inside, slamming it shut behind me. Emma was sitting on the couch, her eyes wide with concern as she looked me over. "What the hell happened to you?" she asked, standing up and crossing the room toward me. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come. The events of the last few days were too jumbled in my mind, too insane to put into words. How could I explain the figure in the mirror, the dreams, the constant feeling of being hunted? I don't know how to explain it," I muttered. "But something's been following me, watching me. It's real, Emma. I know how it sounds, but it's real." She frowned, crossing her arms. "You're scaring me. What's been following you? Like a stalker?" No, it's something else. I don't know what it is, but it came through the mirrors. It's not just a reflection anymore. It's here, and I think it's trying to." Before I could finish, a loud thud echoed through the apartment. Both of us froze, staring at each other for a moment before Emma turned toward the hallway. What the hell was that? My heart was in my throat. I didn't need to guess. I knew what it was. Another thud. This time, it was closer. Emma walked toward the hallway, peering into the shadows. "Maybe it's the pipes or something," she said over her shoulder. "They've been making weird noises all week." "No," I whispered, my skin crawling. "It's not the pipes. Emma, we need to get out of here." She gave me a confused look, but before she could say anything else, the thudding noise echoed again, even louder now, like something was pounding on the walls. The sound was coming from deeper inside the apartment, from her bedroom. "Emma, please," I started, but it was too late. The bedroom door creaked open slowly, and for the first time since I had entered, I noticed the full-length mirror on the far wall. It hadn't been covered, and there, in the glass, the figure stood, grinning. Its black eyes locked onto me, and it slowly raised one long, twisted hand, pressing it against the surface of the mirror. "Is that?" Emma whispered, her voice shaking. "What the hell is that?" The figure in the mirror moved again, its smile widening as it pressed harder, and the glass began to ripple, just like it had back in my apartment. The surface bent and warped, as if it were no longer solid, as if the thing was breaking through. Emma backed away slowly, her face pale with terror. "What the fuck is that thing, Jess?" "It's here," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It's coming through." We both stood frozen, watching in horror as the figure pushed harder, its hand finally breaking free of the glass. It was reaching for us, the room growing colder with each passing second. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Emma's arm and pulling her toward the door. We bolted out of the apartment and down the hallway, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. I could feel it behind us, could feel the weight of its presence, like it was right on our heels, chasing us through the narrow corridor. We didn't stop running until we were outside, gasping for breath. Emma doubled over, hands on her knees, her eyes wide with panic. "What the fuck was that?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. All I could think about was the fact that it had found me again, and now it was getting stronger. It was no longer bound by the mirrors, no longer confined to the reflections. It could move through them, slip through the cracks, and follow me wherever I went. "Jess, what are we going to do?" Emma asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I said, staring up at the building, my mind racing. "I don't think we can stop it." We stood there in the dark, both of us trembling, as the wind whipped through the empty streets. I didn't know where to go, didn't know how to fight something like this. But one thing was certain. It wasn't done with me yet. And wherever I went, it would follow. That thing, whatever it was, had crossed over. And now, there was nowhere left to hide.